Thanks so much, Savannah. Is that what I agreed to talk on? Well, you know, when you get tenure, you pretty much do what you damn well please. I don't pay too much attention, but I'll roughly stick to that. I'm delighted, really, seriously, to be here today. I have spoken on several occasions at Hillsdale, and at Hillsdale events ranging geographically from Washington, D.C. to San Diego. I was with one or two of you in San Diego a few months ago. You are truly a unique American success story, and it's your uniqueness that is serving you well in the crisis that is already impacting. My glasses, half of my glasses fell out, so I was going to almost say impairing higher ed instead of impacting. Either word works, actually. By the way, several students here I've met. I wrote Prague August 4th to 8th on the board, which is sort of a random thing you might think, but there is, for those of you interested, there is a classical liberal studies seminar in Prague, Czech Republic, from August 4th to August 8th, which I am teaching in, and several other professors are teaching in, all English speaking, with involving both American, Czech, and Slovak students. Annie Laurie Sinton there and David Leahy there have been in the seminar before, and they can tell you about it. David will tell you the beer costs $1 a bottle.
And might tell you that too.
Some others might talk about, you know, the study of Locke and Montesquieu and other assorted individuals. But if you're interested, Anthony Hennon, who's sitting next to Anna Laurie over there, back there, he's got his hand up, can fill you in on it. It's dirt cheap because it's heavily subsidized by the Charles Koch Foundation. And the cost of going is less than the airfare, including everything, room, board, and a little bit of beer, right? In fact, quite a bit. We had so much money left at the time that these two cats went. I was buying them Slivovich and all sorts of things, which a professor shouldn't be doing for this. You have to do what you have to do when you're running out of time and you're in a bar. Anyway, today's lecture is in two parts. The first part discusses the lamentable fact that while Americans devote hundreds of billions of dollars of resources and countless amounts of time to the pursuit of higher education, we really have, at best, a rather mediocre record in achieving our goals, whatever they are. We'll get to that in a minute. The second part of the lecture suggests that the public is catching on to this and showing increasing skepticism about higher education, and this is beginning to lead to what Joseph Schumpeter once called creative destruction, the death of some colleges and universities in favor of new ways of meeting our educational and training goals. So this creative destruction has occurred despite massive government subsidies that would have that have permitted much inefficiency and aberrant behavior that would not have been financially feasible without the third-party support of governments, and in some cases, well-meaning private philanthropists. I won't stress the latter part because you like those guys here. Anyway, I better stop right there on that point. But I must say I'm a little bit surprised, in spite of the shrewdness of Hillsdale. I'm a little surprised you invited me because I am an economist, and I see some others here as well. And economists suffer from three problems that I see. First, they're very often wrong. Second, they are usually deadly boring, sort of, you know, accountants without the charisma. And third, they're often viewed as insensitive and uncaring. I will give you just some empirical evidence relating to the first point. Let me give you 4 quick examples. The most famous of all, probably, is 1798, the Reverend Malthus, T.R. Malthus, predicted that human passions, being what they are, and the law of diminishing returns, being what it is, would lead to population growth that in turn would reduce incomes to a near starvation level. Now, 216 years later, incomes per capita in Malthus's England are 20 times higher than when Malthus wrote. People make more in 3 weeks than they did in a year in 1798. Well, that was the 18th century. So let's move on to the 20th century. In October of 1929, the dean of American economists, the most influential economist, was probably Irving Fisher of Yale University. In October of that year, in the New York Times yet, the citadel of all wisdom, he proclaimed that, quote, and I quote him, "The stock market is on a permanently high plateau." Whereupon, almost the next day, it began a breathtaking descent of 87% over 2.5 years for the worst decline in American history. Moving forward, in 1985, arguably, and there's some debate in Hillsdale about this and with me, but arguably America's most influential economist was Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson of MIT, who in his iconic textbook proclaimed, and again, quote, "The Soviet planning system is a powerful engine for economic growth." 7 years later, there was no Soviet Union, and no one today, even Vladimir Putin, and I know Vladimir Putin, he'll talk to me afterwards about this, seriously believes that Soviet central planning promoted economic growth. Even Putin doesn't believe it. Now let's move forward. 5 years ago, early 2009, the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Christina Romer, proclaimed that if the Obama stimulus package were approved, the unemployment rate would not rise above 8%. It promptly rose above 8% for an extraordinary 43 consecutive months, the only time since the Great Depression to do that. Actually, you know, now that you think about it, no White House advisor has been very good at stimulating packages since Monica Lewinsky left the White House. That one was more. I debated a long time before. I had to use that one. It was just too good to pass up. Sorry, I hope I didn't offend anyone. And if I did, the hell with it, I got tenure. Now, I will later on speak of some other deficiency of economists, but let's turn to the first of our real proposition, namely that higher education is not doing terribly well at achieving its objectives. But what are those objectives? Let's return to first principles and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of a college education? And that's where the trouble begins. A university education means different things to different people. A university, and that leads to confusion in determining whether missions are being met, often leads to mediocre results, half achievement of a half dozen, sometimes conflicting objectives. Let me mention 6 possible objectives that some people use to justify higher ed. The vocational goal. Given the contemporary zeitgeist, probably the most important motivation for many paying customers for attending college is they think they will derive a greater income. College is allegedly an investment in human capital with big private payoffs. Number 2, the moral goal. When American universities were founded in the 17th and 18th century, they were perceived as a way of inculcating virtue. Civic virtues as well as the traditional Christian virtues like integrity, honesty, kindness, thrift, and industriousness. Third, by the way, the honorarium I receive is shamefully low, so I'm using no PowerPoint. I call this West Virginia PowerPoint. I use my Number 3, the egalitarian goal. Strongly influencing 19th and 20th century university expansion was the belief that universities were powerful tools in achieving the American dream, allowing persons of humble circumstances to advance economically, or in the insipid jargon of us economists, enhance intergenerational income mobility. Fourth, the knowledge critical thinking goal. Isn't that what college is all about? Learning things, discovering truth and beauty, and how to think about complex problems? Isn't a good college one where students know a lot more about the world in which we live in than they did upon entering 4 years, 5 years, 6 years earlier? Fifth, the research goal. At many campuses, however, an important, sometimes dominant preoccupation is with the creation of new knowledge. Go over to Ann Arbor. This would be true there, I think. It's the dominant preoccupations with the creation of new knowledge, not the dissemination of existing facts. Indeed, many university presidents proclaim the need to become a world-class university belonging to the elite association of American universities. I hear this all the time from university presidents. Then sixth, there's the economic growth goal. Some believe universities are engines of economic growth. Governors love that term. Creating and expanding human capital through teaching and research, and offering their superior wisdom to policymakers allocating public resources. So any decent assessment of higher education asks, how are we doing with respect to these goals? But goal achievement comes at a cost. It takes considerable resources to run American higher education. And monies needed for universities could be used for other things that we value as individuals and as a society. Are we getting good bang for the buck? And if not, where are we getting low value for our expenditure? Why is productivity lower than it should be? I'm not going to talk about this as much as I should today, because I want to keep some of the dirty little secrets of higher education amongst ourselves and not talk about them. Now, I do talk about them quite a bit, and I am a pariah in the higher education establishment, which is why Hillsdale is the only college that will ever invite me to speak. Which is really quite true, but thanks for a good laugh. Who is paying for this education? Are large public subsidies of higher education justified? Is higher education truly a public good that has huge positive externalities or spillover effects deserving of public support? Why do we tax for-profit higher education that does similar things as subsidize not-for-profit universities? But first, before we get into all that, let's look at, with some detail, at our success in meeting those 6 goals I talked about earlier. Are we achieving the goals of higher education? The Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA every few years conducts extensive surveys on faculty and student views on various aspects of higher education. On the most recent freshman survey, the proportion of respondents who said college was important for them to get, college was important for them getting a good, high-paying job reached an all-time high of 85%. That was the #1 goal. 85% of people said, getting a good job while I'm going to college. Far outdistance anything else. And it is true that the average college graduate makes vastly more than the typical high school diploma recipient. For example, the Census Bureau tells us that in 2012, the median male full-time year-round worker with a bachelor's degree made a little over $75,000, compared with $40,000 average for high school graduates. But that $35,000 differential, I think, vastly exaggerates the vocational success associated with attending college, for 4 reasons. First, over 40% of college freshmen who enter college don't graduate in 6 years. And dropouts derive far less earnings advantage per year of study than do college graduates. Going to college is a little bit like having sex. You kind of work hard at it. There's a little bit of enjoyment along the way, but the big payoff comes at the end. It's that way with a diploma. I'm surprised the campus police haven't been here. Second, what is important is what is happening at the margin. the statistics I gave are averages of all college graduates. Recent graduates, unlike earlier ones, are far less likely to get high-paying jobs, at least initially, in the professional, managerial, and technical fields. A study that my research shop, the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, did shows that 48% of college graduates are now in jobs that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us requires a lesser amount of education. 15% of the taxi drivers, for example, have bachelor's degrees now. 1970, it was 0.06%, less than 1. We have 115,520 janitors with bachelor's degrees. And more retail sales clerks have bachelor's degrees than there are soldiers in the U.S. Army. David, we were talking about what you're going to do after you graduate. Anyway, get ready, David. I hope your parents like you because you're going to be living at home. All right. Third, a large, if not precisely defined portion of the college earnings differential relates to superior personal characteristics of those who go to college compared with those who don't. College graduates, on average, have higher IQs, tend to be more disciplined, have higher levels of personal motivation, and so forth, independent of their college training. The degree is a screening device, or a signaling device that tells employers who has these superior attributes. Fourth, there's a huge dispersion around the median earnings. And those with majors unattractive to labor markets do less well than the statistics I just mentioned. Similar, the earnings of those attending elite selective admissions schools are higher than those attending institutions with mediocre reputations and open admissions policy. Thus, the notion that college is for all, or most Americans should attend colleges, ignores these labor market realities. It remains true, however, that college graduates typically derive some earnings advantage because of these signaling dimensions of their degree to employers. But one must ask, could you achieve the signaling value of college for vastly lower costs through testing, perhaps by a new college equivalency test that correlates well with collegiate academic performance? Moreover, even where financial gains to college attendance accrue or come, they do so at high and increasing costs. Tuition fees have been rising faster than prices and faster than incomes, and are typically today 3 or 4 times higher in inflation-adjusted terms than they were a half a century ago. I attended Northwestern University back in the dark ages. My tuition the year I enrolled was $795 for the year. In inflation-adjusted terms, that's about $5,000. That's at an elite private school, which now charges $44,000 or $45,000. So that's what's going on. Of course, I attended there back in, well, never. Those attending be sure, those who did go to college in the 1960s, and I was there then, did not have climbing walls, air-conditioned dorms, and other amenities. But even allowing for this, higher education has become pricey, largely because productivity in higher education, while very elusive to measure, has certainly not risen like it has for the vast majority of human economic endeavors. The number of non-academic professional staff per student has more than doubled in the last 30 years. Roughly speaking, administrators, a byproduct of the academic arms race. Now, it's true that typically college graduates have some virtuous characteristics. For example, statistical evidence suggests that they are less likely to commit major crimes, but more likely to volunteer to work for charitable organizations than high school graduates. College graduates, Gary Becker loves to cite these statistics. He and I have had big fights about this. Well, I love Gary Becker, by the way, except on this point. College graduates tend to have higher levels of civic engagements. They vote more than others. A lot of good that's done us, hasn't it? and they are disproportionately elected to public office. It's over 60 years, for example, since we had an American president without a bachelor's degree. However, it's unclear how much of this increased virtue associated with these positive characteristics came from experiences associated with college life. Crime rates and divorce rates are higher today than they were in, say, 1930, even though the proportion of adult Americans with college degrees has multiplied tenfold in that period. Childbearing out of wedlock has expanded dramatically. Now, in other words, there's a lot of correlations here that it makes, what's causality? A rise in college attendance has coincided with stagnant church attendance. Although statistics show even though college-educated persons themselves on average attend church somewhat more than the population as a whole. But there is a notable anti-religious sentiment pervading much of higher education. So it's not clear then that the move to increase higher participation in higher education has contributed to a society with less dishonesty, crime, substance abuse, and uncivilized behavior. I had some interesting email correspondence with Milton Friedman right before he died on this, and Friedman was wondering whether instead of subsidizing universities, we should perhaps tax them. But this is getting beyond the course of the lecture. If you look at campus behavior, the moral dimension of higher education, the concerns I have about it are heightened. Many moral relativist professors and college resident life staff routinely disparage traditional restraints on human behavior like the Ten Commandments or time-tested institutions like traditional marriage. Now, I am now going to give you a very unscientific, non-random, and small sample that I did. I looked at the 6 most heinous criminals in the last half century I could think of. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Kaczynski, Adam Lanza, he's my most recent addition to the list, Charles Manson, and Timothy McVeigh. Between them, they killed scores of people, committed other heinous crimes like rape and body mutilation. 1/3 were college graduates, 1 from Harvard, mostly educated at a time when a vastly smaller proportion of the adult population received college degrees. Only one of them, Manson, never went to college at all, a below average proportion. So at the highest levels of evil, college attendance is disproportionately highly represented. Now, university presidents claim higher educations provide opportunities for all to reach the top of the occupational ladder in financial success. From the Morrill Act of the 1860s to the Higher Education Act of the 1960s, there was an underlying premise that higher education would allow able and meritorious people to achieve their dreams regardless of financial circumstance. And at the time that the Higher Education Act was passed in 1965, there was some reason and some evidence to believe that expansion in college attendance had perhaps expanded income equality and economic opportunity. For example, the Gini coefficient, the most commonly used measure of income equality, had fallen rather noticeably from the 1920s to that point in time, at the same time that college enrollment was growing. But in 1970, before Pell Grants, the federal government's student financial assistance programs totaled well under $2 billion. Today, they're about $180 billion. In inflation-adjusted terms, these programs have grown at an astonishing 7% a year rate. The economy as a whole growing 3% a year. Yet, despite all of this, the share of recent college graduates coming from the bottom quartile of the income distribution has fallen. More federal aid to help poor people, fewer, in a relative sense, smaller percentage of graduates from the low-income group. Devastating statistic. Former Education Secretary Bill Bennett, I think, was right when he said that the federal programs enable universities to raise tuition fees, scaring off some low-income potential students. Meanwhile, as the proportion of adults with four-year degrees has gone from 11 to 30%, measured income equality has fallen. I did a recent paper with a fellow named Daniel Bennett that suggests diminishing returns set into achieving income equality in higher ed, and that we're way, way beyond the point where it's working in that direction. The College for All movement probably on balance is serving to worsen equality in America today. Don't have time to go into all that. Within higher ed, the gaps between the wealthy, prestigious private schools and the less expensive and selective, both private and state schools, has grown over time. In 1988, there were eight schools listed in the top 25 universities in the U.S. News and World Report rankings that were state schools. 8 out of 25 were state, 17 were private. 2012, 3. Private ones are crowding out the state ones. Similarly, in the 2012 Nakuba Common Fund Endowment Study, the top 1% of surveyed universities had over 30% of the endowment money, a sign of very high inequality within higher education. While prestigious, expensive selective admissions universities with relatively low representation of poor persons routinely graduate 80% or more of their class within 4 years, the rate at open admissions state schools catering to low-income students is typically 20% or less. In my judgment, this promotes greater, not lesser, income equality. But do graduating seniors, don't they know more about our civic surroundings, our historical, economic, and political milieu than do our freshmen? No. If tests administered by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute have any meaning, and I think they do graduating seniors think a lot more critically, making them better able to make perceptive judgments about complex sets of facts? No. If the extensive findings of Richard Aruma and Joseph Broska in Academically Drift are correct, the decennial administered adult literacy survey of the U.S. Department of Education has shown declining literacy among college graduates, even those with masters and PhDs. All of this evidence of modest learning comes at a time, by the way, when student grades are soaring. Higher grades, less learning. Good student evaluations. Some will say that this evidence is deficient and very limited in scope. Yet universities are in the knowledge business and researching all sorts of esoteric trivia, yet they simply do not know themselves how much value added is occurring during the college years, and if they do, they sure as hell don't tell the public out of fear of being shown that they're inferior to competing schools. A lack of transparency is a major problem in American higher education. One thing is fairly obvious, that in order to learn, you have to study. By reading, by attending lectures, by doing online exercises, by writing papers, etc. The evidence from a variety of surveys, for example, the Time Use Survey of the Department of Labor, or a similar survey done by the Higher Education Research Institute, all this suggests that on average, college students in the United States attend class or study less than 30 hours a week, about 30 weeks a year. The amount of time spent on academic endeavors, no more than 900 hours a year, is quite small, probably less than what the typical primary or secondary school student spends. It suggests that college students could handle an academic routine that involves a greater time commitment, maybe closer to that of what their parents spend working to send them to college, which is approximately twice as many hours. I hope that, you know, all the laughter and joy has gone out of the room. It'll get better in a minute. Now, it's true that very much useful research has come out of American universities, improving the quality and quantity of our lives. We're the envy of the world in collegiate basic research. We dominate the lists of Nobel Prizes and other important scholarly forms of recognition. Yet most college faculty are not scientists doing cutting-edge research, and even in the STEM disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and math, the law of diminishing returns applies. Some research is no doubt pretty trivial. Outside the STEM disciplines, vast numbers of papers are written that virtually no one reads or cites, as Mark Bauerlein and Emory has pointed out on multiple occasions. Moreover, professors are teaching less. The proportion of professors with teaching loads of 4 hours a week or less has over doubled since 2000, by the way. I'm sure that's a rare load here at Hillsdale, but it's not uncommon. If you go over to Ann Arbor and you're teaching more than 3 hours a week, you're being, it's cruel and unusual punishment. And all of this robs students of experienced, knowledgeable instructors. Incentives push professors to do ever more trivial research, while at many schools, low-paid adjunct faculty do more of the heavy lifting in the classroom. At most schools, professors with many publications are rewarded relative to those with fewer publications, but superior teaching reputation. Did we really need 21,000 new papers on William Shakespeare since 1985? We had that many. Wouldn't 1,000 new papers been enough on Shakespeare? Now, politicians promote and proclaim that investing in higher ed is necessary to remain globally competitive. Obama's saying this all the time. And that greater university spending promotes economic growth. Prove it! I've run over 1,000 regression equations looking at the collegiate spending economic growth relationship, and I find either of one or two things. Either the relationship is in the opposite direction of what one would expect. The more you spend on colleges, the less growth you get. Or, to be charitable, I usually try to come up with the following conclusion: there's no relationship whatsoever between the two. Again, diminishing returns is at work. Taking funds from an efficient private sector to spend governed by markets and competitive environments, taking funds from these people and providing them to universities to turn out persons maybe taking jobs as taxi cab drivers seems to me intuitively counterproductive. There are better uses of these scarce resources. The emphasis to this point on evaluating outcomes, it neglects many of the details explain why costs went up, which I was supposed to talk about, so let me say just a few things about it. Resources are vastly underutilized, often involving empty classrooms and offices for many, many months a year. Professors teach little. Students do little studying. Moreover, even when resources are heavily utilized, many of them are used ineffectively. In many schools, incentives are all screwed up. Advising students brings little reward, but publishing unread articles for the Journal of Last Resort has a big payoff. University governance is typically archaic. It is often unclear who makes major decisions, and even when the lines of authority are well drawn, much governance is by committee, which leads to slow decision-making, often non-innovative compromise solutions to problems needing prompt and radical innovation. The goals of universities are often nebulous and difficult to measure. There's no real bottom line, making evaluation of success difficult. Administrative bloat is endemic in many schools. I don't know about here at Hillsdale, but it is all over. There are 2,200 employees in the office of the president of the University of California. Not one of them is teaching. In fact, not one of them is associated with a campus of the University of California. They're in a central office. 2,200. Administrative bloat is endemic at many schools. Many schools have more administrators than faculty. A growing percentage of faculty members do little real teaching. Big-time athletic programs are not only costly, but often scandalously corrupt. I noticed Mercer beat Duke. Did you notice that? Yeah, that's the athletic thing. Professor Wilson was starting to nod off. I wanted to wake him up. That That came through at 2:32 in the last hour or so. Rent-seeking behavior is rampant. Excessive salaries paid sub-administrators are not only costly, but reduce the moral high ground historically held by collegiate institutions. Colleges admit vastly too many underprepared students, as there are few negative consequences to the school from their dropping out, even though the individuals themselves often suffer serious long-term financial and psychological burdens. This, I could go on and on and on. Costs have risen rapidly. The economic and intellectual success of higher education has to relate benefits to costs. It costs far more to educate an American college student in the US than in, say, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, or Korea, all major industrial peers. In inflation-adjusted terms, the typical student today pays 3 or 4 times as much to go to school as its predecessor 50 years ago. The national share of national output devoted to higher education has doubled in that period, despite substantial growth in that output. Now, I've painted a picture, it's pretty bad. Before I turn to the second part of the lecture, I perhaps should deal with the second of the 3 deficiencies of economists that I told you about at the beginning, namely that economists are deadly boring. Let me illustrate this with a little story, which was related to me, by the way, by the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. A woman went to her doctor, only to get devastating news. She had an inoperable brain tumor and had only 6 months to live. She despaired. "Doctor, isn't there something you can do for me?" He said, "Unfortunately, no, but I have some good advice." She said, "What is it?" He replied, "Marry an economist and move to North Dakota." She said, "Why on earth would I want to do that?" He replied, "You won't live a day longer, but it sure will seem like a long, long Now, moving on to the second part of the lecture, I'm running a few minutes behind schedule. I'm hurting myself too much. I hope this doesn't bother you, but we make something, they have something called an afterglow, whatever that is. Is that where you go to the bar? Make it slightly abridged. Plato was, I think, onto something when he proclaimed that necessity is the mother of invention. The necessity here is that the cost of higher education is perceived correctly, in my judgment, to be rising relative to the benefits. The earnings differentials between holders of a high school diploma and those with a college degree in inflation-adjusted terms actually fell in absolute terms between 2006 and 2012 for both males and females. The earnings gain associated with the degrees became less, the cost became greater. So there's 2 things going on here. There's a disconnect between the reality of American labor markets and higher ed, and that, of course, is aggravated by the fact that we have screwed up our economy badly in the last few years with disastrous public policies discouraging work, everything from Obamacare to excessive Social Security disability payments to overly generous unemployment insurance, et cetera, et cetera. Take any econ course at Hillsdale and you'll learn about this. Don't take one at any other university in the country. Part of this, I think, reflects the college for all mantra preached by our political leaders, our high school guidance counselors and others, the notion that you'll be a failure in life if you don't go to college. Labor market projections by the Department of Labor suggest a large portion of new jobs expected to be created over the next decade do not really require a college degree, yet we continue to urge high school graduates to go to college, etc., etc. A second thing is that colleges have been caught up in this academic arms race that I've talked about, and it's largely financed by growing federal student financial assistance programs that Hillsdale has very shrewdly avoided, very, very wisely avoided. I do the rankings for Forbes magazine of colleges and universities. Every year we rank 650 colleges. We get data on 649, and then we always have to say, what the hell are we going to do with Hillsdale? So I call up Larry Arnn and say, Larry, you're not going to be in the rankings this year. You actually do pretty well in our rankings. Do you want to be in there? He said, yeah, we'd like to be in there. So I said, well, give me the data and blah, blah, blah. So we go through this every year. So we have this academic arms race. The federal loan programs are pushing up costs. And this, by the way, has led, ironically, to higher tuitions. Higher tuition means state legislators are, in some cases, reducing state appropriations from what they otherwise would have been, which actually I think is a good thing. But but on balance, the college still end up with more dollars. So colleges have become the model of inefficiency. In most American life, it takes fewer workers to make any given amount of goods and services than it did a half a century ago. It takes fewer hours of work to produce a car, fewer hours of work to produce a ton of steel or type a letter than it did 50 years ago. But in higher ed, the opposite's the case. It takes more employees to educate a given number of students than it did 2 generations ago. Schools have added all kinds of teaching professional staff, diversity coordinators, public relations specialists, recreational staff employees, and other bureaucrats. Subsidies for intercollegiate athletics have soared. Teaching loads have fallen to produce this mind-boggling research we're supposed to have. The campus edifice complex has led to massive construction, yet most buildings are vastly underutilized. My guess is the typical faculty office in the United States is used maybe 10 or 12 hours a week for maybe 35 weeks a year, 400 hours a year. Any private business that ran that way would be broken a few nanoseconds. But meanwhile, every college, do you have a climbing wall here? You're getting one. Yes, see, Hillsdale's on the cutting edge of being behind. Which is cool, in a way. I think it's cool. We could have an argument, should you build the statue for Ronald Reagan or build a climbing wall? We get into some interesting issues here, but this is beyond the course of the lecture. I'm glad Dr. Arndt isn't here, actually. And by the way, in most areas of human endeavor, technology lowers costs. It permits better products or allows less labor and other resources to be used to make existing products. Better technologies raises labor productivity, wages are standard of living. Higher education, however, considers technology to be a financial burden. A lot of campuses charge technology fees. What would happen if the Ford Motor Company said, we're putting a technology fee on because we had to build a new machine last year? Goodbye, Ford. Instead of using computers to lower labor costs, we continue to teach in the same old ways, adding a little PowerPoint or Blackboard or emailing along the way. With the possible exception of prostitution, teaching is the only profession I know that has had absolutely no productivity advance in the 2,400 years since Socrates taught the youth of Athens. How does a good university or college president maximize his or her job security? He makes key constituencies happy. Those that could cost him his job or give him trouble. To do that, first of all, he or she has to raise prodigious sums of money. From governments, from private donors, from foundations, and from students through higher tuition fees, however you can get the money. He or she then uses those funds to bribe powerful campus interests. The faculty get good raises, salaries, sort of good raises, low teaching loads, and good parking. The students get high grades for little work, thanks to great inflation, and the administration implicitly condones hedonistic student behavior, including lots of partying, booze, drugs, and/or sex. The top administrators get big salaries and lots of assistants to do their heavy lifting. The rich alumni and trustees get almost any eccentric thing they want. Students rack up big student debts, but in the short run, almost everyone on campus is happy. But in spite of massive government subsidies, costs are rising faster than benefits, and more students are finding it difficult to pay off their loans. The system is unsustainable. Something has to give. So I need to talk about that. But I promised you, and let's be quick, I promised you to explain why economists are insensitive. And let me give you a quick story on the insensitivity. Shortly after 9/11, a suburban New York country club decided to honor 4 blind firemen who were blinded fighting fires at the World Trade Center. It provided free golf privileges to the firefighters. On the same day, a threesome of a physician, a Catholic priest, and an economist were planning to play. The golf pro told the threesome, "Please show some understanding. It will be slow playing today since there are 4 blind firemen who are heroes of 9/11 playing in front of you." The physician said, "We understand. Indeed, I'd like to chat with the firemen because I have a promising new technique that sometimes can restore partial vision to those blinded by fires." The priest joined in. "I too perhaps can be of help. I have counseled countless persons in similar situations, and I have some thoughts that might provide them some comfort." The economist glared at them all and said, "What's wrong with you guys? These firemen will slow everyone down. Make them play at night." My university president told me that one. I have to admit that was pretty good. Best thing in his entire tenure at my university was that joke. But in spite of subsidies, colleges are not immune from market forces. The market forces may seemingly have been muted or disguised or pushed aside, but the markets work no matter what. The subsidies have kept them from working efficiently, but they're working. And I believe in the next decade, several hundred universities will die, and that new forms of educational delivery will gain market share. I don't think traditional residential education will die, and indeed I think there's a niche for quality residential education that not only will continue but maybe even thrive. But there are a lot of challenges going on in higher ed. First, economic growth in the U.S. is slowing down, it seems, long term, relative to the past. Higher education is increasingly perceived, correctly, in my judgment, as a somewhat risky investment, often with a long rate of return. Third, the 18 to 22-year-old age group is not growing. It's just flat. Fourth, the aging of the American population plus excessive entitlement commitments make it difficult for public subsidies for higher education to continue to grow. Now, I can elaborate on that, but just believe me that that's true. If you don't believe me, well, tough. So I think several factors are going to force changes in higher ed. Let's mention just 3. First, enrollments are no longer growing. Indeed, aggregate college enrollments are in slight decline at the moment. For a few years, the stagnation in the number of college applications has been particularly great in the last few years at relatively non-selected schools that are either very expensive or have mediocre reputations. Poorly endowed, small liberal arts colleges with no national reputation, or urban state universities with low graduation rates. But some even prestigious schools are now facing a problem. What happened to applications at Dartmouth for next fall? Down 14% over last year. To deal with this, some colleges are doing impossible things. Ashland University cut its tuition fee by 10%. A sale at a university. Ever heard a university have a sale? Sale. Second, the debt load of many schools is also high. Borrowing to pay for the edifice complex. Moody's, read the Moody's reports. Increasingly pessimistic about colleges and universities, thinking they're increasingly risky places for investors to invest in bonds. And third, as the cost of a piece of paper called a college diploma explodes, but its value becomes smaller, alternative ways of certifying employer competency are gaining some attention. Let me briefly elaborate on that. Out of desperation to lower the cost of college, some schools are finally embracing technology, trying the use of MOOCs, massively open online courses, other low-cost outsource type courses to reduce instructional costs. There is some signs that new test-based means of demonstrating competence may be evolving. that at the extreme could substitute for a college diploma. For example, maybe we'll go to a 3-hour national exam called the National College Equivalency Test. I'm making this up, but it sounds pretty good. The first half of the test could be an examination of critical thinking, analytical reasoning, and writing skills, maybe using the Critical Learning Assessment or CLA Plus test. Second half could be a test of general knowledge using some of the Institute for, it's ICS study. 75 multiple choice question, a little bit of math, science, history, economics, government, literature, to see if people have know anything at all about the world. And put it together, you got a pretty decent test. Higher ed just never changes. I should have shut up by now, but I'm near the end. It's coming to an end. Let's look, I took the top 10 companies in the Fortune 500 for 1994, 20 years ago. Most of them have had major change in the last 20 years. General Motors, Exxon, Philip Morris, Mobil, Chrysler, and Texaco. GM and Chrysler went bankrupt, Exxon and Mobil merged, Philip Morris split into multiple companies, Texaco became part of Chevron, Chrysler was sold to a foreign company. Of the other four, only one of them, Ford, had a close call with bankruptcy. Another one, IBM, lost its leadership role among computer-based businesses. Change is the rule in private business, creative destruction. Now, I then went to the top 10 schools on the U.S. News and World Report national rankings for 1994. Not only are all alive today, 9 of the top 10 in the 2013 rankings were in the top 10 in 1994. The only school that dropped out was Cornell. And you know, Cornell hasn't disappeared. Cornell's doing pretty well. Just not as well. You know, they went from 10th to 13th or something. Big whoop. Change is little and minuscule. New prominent universities are near non-existent. Dying old schools are rare. But as the college value proposition declines, as government reluctance to finance ever more expensive education grows, as economic growth stagnates, necessity will force change that may manifest itself in some schools going out of business. Who's going to survive? I don't know. Hillsdale's one that will. But there will be schools, let's use the state of Michigan. Will there be an Adrian College or an Albion College in 2025? Who knows? Aren't they in your conference? You don't even play. Do you play anything? I saw kids playing frisbee out there. We have an ultimate frisbee team in our school. One of my buddies' students is on it. But schools, it's a 50-50. I think Adrian College is a 50-50 proposition. Metropolitan Detroit has 5 large public universities. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Eastern Michigan University, Wayne State University, Oakland University, and the University of Michigan at Dearborn. I can't help but believe at least one of them will be merged out of existence. Maybe the U of M at Dearborn will merge with Eastern Michigan and Wayne State. Both Eastern Michigan and Wayne State are academic disasters by any measure. The 6-year graduation rate at Wayne State is 28%. The 4-year graduation rate is 10%. I mean, this is what the data show. Roughly for every student who starts, same at Eastern, for every student who starts and graduates in 6 years, 2 drop out. I assign also, some other things may happen. I assign a 30% probability that the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor will go private. Did you read today's Inside Higher Ed? A whole bunch of schools in Pennsylvania are talking about just pulling out of the system. So things are happening. Colleges hate change. There are few incentives to cut costs, to meet labor market demands, to teach students substantive content, and so forth. Governments have financed much of this inefficiency, but as the props of the system are undermined, government subsidies stop growing exponentially. As the public clamors and ultimately obtains information showing some of the scandals that are higher education's dirty little secrets, change is coming. including such mid-sized institutional change, for example, as a decline in academic tenure in a lot of other institutional change I don't have time to talk about. But not to mention the more massive Schumpeterian creative destruction. This is coming. For me, I think this is good for America. Thank you very much. I'm allowed to answer questions for 4 minutes. Yes, sir.
What do you think of new for-profit universities like the University of Phoenix that spend so much on advertising but still has pretty mediocre results?
Well, the University of Phoenix, one thing about there are two things about the for-profit school. I have a love-hate relationship with them. The love relationship is there is greater market forces at work there, in the sense that they get no state appropriations, again, less in the public subsidy. But they indirectly get so much subsidy because about 80–85% of the revenue comes from student loan programs and so forth. So they are sort of a hybrid in a way. I think they should be allowed to exist. I'm all for them. I have supported them. I have think that they do some good things. There's some bad actors. Right now there's a proposal to put some of the bad actors out of business. They propose to do this for the for-profits, but they don't want to touch Wayne State. Why not put Wayne State out of business? If 9 out of 10 kids going to Wayne State don't graduate in the advertised time, isn't that deceptive? Isn't it? Why do they let why don't they put it out of its misery? Chicago State, and Chicago is worse. I think it's 4%. 4%. 4%. I repeat, 4%. 1 out of 25 graduates. When someone graduates there, they cancel classes for the day. I made that up. By the way, they threatened to sue me once, and for just pointing out the statistics. I look at the iPad statistics. That's what it says. I'm sorry. Why don't they put these out? Now, some of the for-profits are in the same category, to get to your question. And some of those ought to, if you're going to use those criteria, you should apply it to them. I'm not saying they should be favorably treated. But I have visited some for-profit schools, and I must say some of them are sort of laser focused on students, because that's their bread and butter. That's where they get their money, tuition. And you don't see that at some universities, including some very distinguished universities I've been at in this state, one of which is less than 100 miles away, that I won't mention, but it is always listed as one of the 5 best public universities in the United States. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, can you, apart from the social and cultural factors, can you comment from maybe perhaps with an economic perspective on the gender imbalance that we're seeing rising more and more with a larger percentage of female college students?
I do think we should charge men less than women. I think to right the imbalance, we should do. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that 50 years ago, higher ed was considered to be primarily something for males, right. 60 years ago. 60% male, 40% female, roughly, something like that. And now it's pretty much the reverse. And I think that is one of the most interesting issues of our time. I think you ask me my opinion, I think male have been denuded. I think they've been, I think they've, I could use picturesque biological language to describe it, but it would probably be inappropriate. But the government has removed a lot of the historic role that males play in society. You don't have to work, the government will provide. Just to pick that one. So labor force participation is now falling very much for men relative to women, and that imbalance. You see it in all other areas of life. And so why go to college? And more, I think the neutering of the American male in a society where we want to seem warm and fuzzy towards females. I'm sorry if I'm annoying anyone. My wife isn't here, so I can say this. No, I just think it's a serious problem. I think there's a huge underutilization of resources that has arose from it. By the way, on the same token, I think it was great that the female labor force participation and growth of college enrollment occurred. I don't misunderstand me. But it has gone beyond the 50-50 natural balance, and so one has to ask what the problem is on the other end. Good question. Am I supposed to stop? I'll talk forever, you know.
I think
We're supposed to stop, yeah. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I apologize for talking too long. Thank you.